The roots of role-playing games goes back to the early days of gaming, but cooperative RPGs were definitely more of a rarity. So let's talk about co-op 8-bit RPGs. The first game I'm talking about is Tunnels of Doom, and this came out on the TI-99 way back in 1982. It's a pioneering title when it comes to RPGs. It's a fusion of fantasy and computing, and it's one of the first co-op RPG games of all time. The game features adventurers exploring a dungeon in a first-person perspective, with 4 players taking control of distinct characters. In encounters, the viewpoint shifts to a top-down display, enabling turn-based combat, and each character has their own unique abilities. Unfortunately, outside of combat, the other players can't do much. And it is turn-based, so outside of player 1, the other players will be inactive quite often. Nonetheless, this is an early RPG, and it's just cool that it included co-op at all. Little Ninja Brothers on the NES came out in 1990. It's a sequel to Kung Fu Heroes. In Japan, this series is known as Super Chinese, and this one is called Super Chinese 2 on the Famicom. This is a pretty unique RPG, and it's completely designed around 2-player co-op. It has the same familiar top-down, open-world type of map, similar to a Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior type of game, and it has random battles as well. But instead of a turn-based game, it turns into a single-screen beat-em-up, where you can kick and punch and fight the various monsters with a friend. There's also towns where you can go to upgrade your abilities, rest, and talk to villagers. This is a pretty unique game. I haven't really played anything else like it. There's just not a lot of co-op RPGs on the NES. And in the following year, 1991, we got Super Chinese 3, but this one only came out on the Famicom in Japan. The gameplay changes up quite a bit here. You have the same open-world top-down sections and the beat-em-up parts like the original, but now they added turn-based combat as well. And you have some 2D platforming sections, and the platforming's pretty solid. You're able to climb on walls as well as on the ceiling. This pretty much offers everything that the previous game did, but it's just much better. And luckily there are fan translations now. So if you haven't played Super Chinese 3, definitely give it a shot. While we're talking about the Super Chinese series, let's move over to the Game Boy. In 1993, we got Ninja Boy 2. It's very similar to Little Ninja Brothers. It's the second game on Game Boy, but it's the first one to have co-op gameplay. In Japan, the Game Boy series is called Super Chinese Land, similar to how the Mario games were called Mario Land on Game Boy. And if you have 2 Game Boys and a link cable and 2 copies of the game, you can play this in 2-player co-op. It's pretty much more of the same. Not much stands out here, but again, it's another solid co-op RPG. And then in 1995 on the Game Boy, we had Super Chinese Land 3, and this one was only released in Japan. Again, I don't have much else to add to this one, it's kind of just more of the same. But at this point, you probably know if you like this series or not. So if you do, you'll probably like this game. Also on Game Boy, we had Ultima Ruins of Virtue. This came out in 1991 in Japan and 92 in the US. This is a top-down action RPG, kind of similar to a Zelda game. This one's a bit slow and kind of clunky. And like the other games mentioned, if you have 2 Game Boys and a link cable, as well as 2 copies of the game, you're able to play it in co-op. But one of the things that I found to be incredibly annoying is if one of you is in the way, the other person cannot exit the door. So you're constantly getting in each other's ways. And when the controls are already a little bit unresponsive, these close quarters get really annoying really fast. The combat is really nothing special here, but the game has some classic RPG elements. You have various classes, and you're able to power up your characters. It's not one of the best action RPGs, but again, it's cool that this exists on the Game Boy. And in 1993, we got the sequel, Ultima Ruins of Virtue 2. I think this one's a big step up. The visuals are a little bit better, the gameplay moves a lot better, and the controls just feel tighter. This one still has the same kind of combat. You move around on the open world map, and you go into dungeons, and you fight various monsters. It's a good idea to change up the characters, have one player do long distance attacks and the other one do close combat. This one has some kind of cool cutscene images. If you're going to play one of the Ultima games on Game Boy, definitely go with this one. Another game to only come out in Japan on the Famicom was 100 World Story. This is a very interesting combination of a board game and an RPG. There are 4 different characters that are always in play here. If you play it by yourself, the remaining characters will always be played by AI, but you can play it with a friend. You can either work together or against each other. When you both land on an opponent at the same time, you can team up in a turn-based battle. The goal is to get better equipment and gain experience, primarily through fighting monsters and doing quests. There are 3 different game types, each with a different end goal, such as defeating a dragon that's terrorizing the kingdom. This one's worth trying just for its unique gameplay, and there is a fan translation out now, so anyone can try it out. How about we talk about the Zelda 2 co-op ROM hack? The ROM hacking community has done a great job of making Zelda 2 a co-op game. I've always loved Zelda games, but most of them are single-player experiences. Anytime someone's able to go back and hack the games to make it a co-op experience, you definitely get my attention. And Zelda 2 is one of the few Zelda games that actually could be considered a full-blown RPG. This one has the top-down overworld map. You can go into various towns to talk to the villagers, and it actually has a leveling system where you can power up your health as well as your weapons. Of course, this game is incredibly difficult, but it is a little bit easier when you can play it with a friend. A game that most of you probably know is River City Ransom. This is definitely one of the best co-op games on the NES. It combines a lot of different genres. Primarily, it's a 2D beat-em-up, but it also has some light platforming and, of course, some RPG elements. So between battles, you're able to pick up money and go back to the town and upgrade your stats, which ultimately makes you stronger, and you can learn new abilities that help you progress through the battles. This one took me a while to get the hang of, but once I finally figured it out, you could play through this game pretty quickly. The secret is gather money as fast as you can and just upgrade to the fast kicking and fast punching attacks. Once you're able to do that, you can take on just about any enemy pretty easily. And then we had Swords and Serpents on the NES in 1990. It's a first-person dungeon crawler RPG, and it can be played with up to 4 players. One player is the party leader. There are 3 different classes. You have Warrior, Thief, and Magician. The party leader navigates the maze, while the other players can assist in combat. It can be kind of boring for the other players, as player 1 will be taking control of most of the action. You always have a map on screen, so it can kind of help you navigate through the mazes. I don't think this is one of the best co-op RPGs, but for the time, especially on a home console, it was definitely a very unique experience. The next group of games I'm talking about lean more towards dungeon crawlers and Zelda clones, but I feel like both of those genres are very much connected to RPGs, so I wanted to cover them as well. They might be missing some of the leveling up mechanics, and you're not really talking to any NPCs or anything like that, so some of the RPG elements are lacking. So maybe they're more RPG adjacent. But if you're a fan of the genre, I'm sure you'll like these games as well. The first one goes all the way back to 1982. This is also called Swords and Serpents, and it came out on the Intellivision. Yes, this is the original Swords and Serpents. This is a pretty forgotten game, but I could see how this really could have influenced future action RPGs and dungeon crawlers. It's played from an overhead view. Even though the graphics are very simplistic, with a little imagination, you'll definitely recognize that this is a dungeon crawler, and you can play it co-op. One player plays as the prince and the other plays as the wizard. The wizard is able to break walls, shoot fireballs, heal, and freeze objects. The prince has a sword and is able to do close combat attacks. The game might not hold up that well, but if you're able to get past the visuals and the dated gameplay, it's pretty impressive for its time. And the year prior, we had Quest for the Rings on the Magnavox Odyssey 2. This came out in 1981. So this is the oldest game on the list. This is a hybrid board and video game. And I'm not talking about a game like 100 World Story. This physical game came with a physical board game. So you're playing a board game while you're playing the game. I tried figuring this out. I actually had this on my Magnavox at one point, and it's kind of a lot for me to wrap my head around. But the basic concept is, it's kind of a dungeon crawler, and players assume roles of heroes aiming to retrieve 10 rings. while navigating the mazes. This also has some stealth mechanics, because instead of constant combat, you want to avoid the enemies as much as possible. There are 4 distinct heroes, each with unique abilities. You have a warrior who can push the enemies, and a wizard with ranged attacks, as well as a changeling who can turn invisible, and a phantom who can pass through walls. Again, the visuals are very dated. They just look like little stick figures, and you can see that there are other stick figures that are supposed to be dinosaurs or dragons. This is a time where you needed to use a little bit of imagination. So if you can get past the visuals, and maybe if you have the physical board game, give it a shot. This is one of those games that maybe doesn't hold up, but it's just really cool that this exists. And it's, yeah, a very unique experience. And then in 1983, we had Dandy, also known as Dandy Dungeon. And this is considered to be like the grandfather of dungeon crawlers. This came out on the Atari 8-bit home computers, and it's one of the earliest games to have 4-player co-op gameplay. So in this game, you all have bows and arrows. Luckily, there are unlimited arrows. You're gonna walk around the mazes and shoot all the various monsters. And while you're exploring, you grab keys to unlock the doors, and then you find bombs to locate the exit for each level. Basically that's the whole game. But Dandy's main claim to fame is that Gauntlet is probably the most popular dungeon crawler of all time. The creators of that game basically stole everything from Dandy. You could say that they were influenced, but from what I understand, the creators of Gauntlet were sued by the creators of Dandy. This is another game that has some very basic visuals, but I think this one holds up pretty well. While we're at it, let's go ahead and start talking about Gauntlet. This kind of took what Dandy was doing, but took it up a few notches. 1985, we had Gauntlet come out into the arcades. There's of course numerous home ports as well, but the arcade version is probably the best version of this original Gauntlet. You could play as an elf, a wizard, a warrior, and Valkyrie. And yeah, this is very similar to Dandy, but it kind of refined the dungeon crawler experience, and Gauntlet definitely is the more influential game. Gauntlet's the game that everybody remembers. The one thing I don't like though is with Gauntlet, your health is a timer, so it's constantly counting down. Which I guess that makes sense for the arcade game, as they want you to put in more coins. It doesn't make sense for the home console versions. I don't know why they kept that in there. So if Gauntlet was a rip-off of Dandy, the next game was a rip-off of Gauntlet. This is called Druid. It came out on a number of home computers, and even came out on the Famicom. But the version that I'm talking about came out in 1986 on the Commodore 64. This one's pretty interesting. It has the same kind of dungeon crawling gameplay, and I kind of like the visuals here. This one can only be played with 2-player co-op, however, and the second player is almost like an assist player. They play as this character that's a golem. There were tons of Dandy and Gauntlet clones that came out at this time, especially on home computers. This is the one that stands out the most to me. I really enjoyed this game. And a few years later, we got Dark Chambers in 1989. This came out on the Atari 2600 and the Atari 7800. The gameplay is pretty much the same between the two, but the visuals are very different, with the Atari 2600 version being very archaic with stick figure type characters. The gameplay is still intact with that version. And from what I understand, Dark Chambers is basically a continuation of Dandy. It at least is made by the same creator. And it has the same kind of dungeon crawling gameplay, and you can play it with a friend. Basically, every single level is a letter, so you go through A to Z, the entire alphabet, and you just attack various monsters, walk around, go to the exit, move on to the next level. And each level is basically a different color and a different formation of a maze. There's not much else to say about this game, but it's a really solid dungeon crawler. If you haven't played Dark Chambers, try it out. And, you know, both versions are really good. But the 7800 version visually is obviously much better. And we have Rolan's Curse on the Game Boy. It came out in 1990. Just like the other Game Boy games, you're going to need 2 Game Boys and a link cable and 2 copies of the game. But this game stands out from the others because it's more of like a Zelda clone. It has similar combat to an action RPG or a dungeon crawler, but this one definitely looks more like a Zelda game, but it's much more linear. There are only 3 levels and kind of a smaller final boss fight. I really love Rolan's Curse. It's one of my favorite co-op games on the Game Boy. You have your basic sword and you can get a wand. The wand is weaker, but it can shoot long distance. So there could definitely be some strategy between both players taking on different weapons. But the main benefit to playing this on Game Boy is that you don't actually have to be stuck on the same screen. You could split up and explore separately, which is definitely an underutilized feature. Definitely give Roland's Curse a try if you haven't. It's easier than ever to just emulate co-op Game Boy games. You can even do it on one computer with a split screen. Or if you have the Mr. FPGA console like I have, they have a built-in core where you could just click on the game, boot it up, and it automatically starts it in a split screen view. So there's no excuse not to try some of these co-op Game Boy games now. The final game I want to talk about is actually a new game coming out on the NES. I've only been able to play the demo. It's called Save the Queen. I'm not sure when the full game actually releases, but it had a successful Kickstarter. The full game should be released sometime in the near future, hopefully this year. But this is another co-op Zelda clone, and this one just does everything right. It has the exploration, it has solid combat, and it has the co-op gameplay. You also get to talk to and interact with various NPCs, so the game's not just straightforward linear like Roland's Curse. This one involves a little bit more puzzling and just figuring out where to go. From what I played in the demo, this is a really solid game, and it's honestly the co-op Zelda game that we deserve to have back in the day. So I'm really excited for Save the Queen to come out. Okay, so there you go. There's a bunch of co-op 8-bit RPGs and dungeon crawlers. What are some that we missed? And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch our top 10 co-op dungeon crawler video. And thank you for watching.